What did Albert Speer's daughter really know about the man who designed Hitler's empire? What secrets did she carry from childhood into a life spent confronting one of history's most complex legacies? And what exactly did she reveal when she finally chose to speak? Albert Speer occupies a singular and deeply unsettling place in the story of the Third Reich. He was not a soldier, not a fanatical ideologue in the mould of Himmler or Heydrich, and not a mass murderer in any direct blood-on-the-hands sense. He was an architect, an aesthete, a man who claimed to love beauty and order and the grand sweep of history made visible in stone and steel. He rose from relative obscurity to become Hitler's personal architect, then the Reich Minister of Armaments and War Production, a position that placed him at the very centre of Germany's industrial war machine. He was, by any measure, one of the most powerful men in the Third Reich. And yet, after Germany's defeat, he made the audacious and ultimately successful argument that he had known nothing of the Holocaust. He performed remorse on the stand at Nuremberg, while his colleagues were being led to the gallows. He served 20 years in Spandau prison and emerged to write memoirs that sold millions of copies and cast him, for decades, as the conscience of the Nazi elite, the good German who had been seduced by power and had lived to regret it. His children grew up with that version of their father, but what did they actually know? What did they see inside the Speer household? What was said around the dinner table? What was left unspoken? And what was actively concealed? In this video, we will find out. We will explore what Albert Speer's daughter Hilda, along with his other children, revealed about family life inside one of the most gilded households in Hitler's Germany, and what those revelations tell us about the man, the myth, and the devastating cost of a lie that lasted decades. So, without further ado, let's begin. Albert Speer was born on March 19, 1905, in Mannheim, Germany, into a prosperous upper-middle-class family. His father, also named Albert, was a successful architect, and the young Speer grew up in an environment that prized culture, education, and professional achievement. He had two brothers, Ernst and Hermann, and the family lived comfortably through the turbulent years of the First World War and the chaotic Weimar Republic that followed. Speer studied architecture in Karlsruhe, Munich, and finally Berlin, where he came under the influence of Heinrich Tessenow, a celebrated architect whose spare, classicist aesthetic would shape the young students' tastes profoundly. Speer was brilliant, ambitious, and hungry for greatness. He was also, by his own later admission, politically naive, or at least that is what he would have the world believe. He joined the Nazi Party in January 1931, attending a speech by Hitler in Berlin that he would later describe as a revelation. Speer was not, he insisted, drawn in by the racial hatred or the violent anti-Semitism that coursed through the party's veins. He was drawn in by the energy, the vision, the sense that here was a movement that would sweep away the mediocrity and humiliation of Weimar and replace it with something magnificent and enduring. He was an architect seduced by the promise of the grandest commission in history. That seduction would prove catastrophic for millions of people and ultimately for Speer himself. His rise was swift. He first caught Hitler's attention in 1933 when he was assigned to redesign the interior of the Reich Propaganda Ministry and subsequently the renovation of the Reich Chancellery. Hitler, himself a frustrated artist with a passionate but untutored love of architecture, was enchanted by Speer. Here was a man who could take the grandiose visions in Hitler's head and render them in marble and limestone and granite. The two men developed a relationship that was, by all accounts, something close to friendship, or at least as close to friendship as Hitler was capable of. Speer was invited to the Berghof, Hitler's alpine retreat. He attended private dinners. He was, in the peculiar social geography of the Nazi hierarchy, one of the inner circle, though he always maintained that this proximity to power did not make him complicit in the regime's crimes. The great project that cemented Speer's place in Hitler's affections was the plan for the reconstruction of Berlin. Together, they conceived Germania, a rebuilt capital city of breathtaking and terrifying scale, a metropolis that would surpass ancient Rome in its grandeur and serve as the architectural centerpiece of the 1,000-year Reich. The plans included a great dome 17 times larger than St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, a triumphal avenue 4 kilometers long, and vast governmental buildings designed to dwarf any structure that had come before them. The project required the forcible displacement of tens of thousands of Jewish families from their Berlin apartments, a fact that Speer would later claim he had not fully grasped at the time. The evidence suggests otherwise. In 1938, Speer was tasked with an equally enormous project, the design and construction of the Nuremberg rally grounds where the Nazi Party's annual spectacles of mass devotion were staged. The Zeppelin Field, the Congress Hall, the Great Road, the Cathedral of Light created by tens of thousands of anti-aircraft searchlights aimed at the night sky, these were Speer's creations, and they were masterpieces of totalitarian aesthetics, designed precisely to overwhelm individual consciousness and subsume the viewer into the collective ecstasy of the Reich. Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will is the most famous document of those rallies, but it was Speer's stage that she filmed. He was the architect of Nazi mythology made physical. Through all of this, Speer was also a family man. He had married Margaret Weber in 1928, a marriage that would endure until his death and produce 6 children. The family initially lived modestly, but as Speer's star rose in the Nazi firmament, so too did the material conditions of their domestic life. They eventually occupied a spacious home in Berlin-Schlachtensee, a comfortable southern suburb of the capital. There was also a country estate in Obersalzberg near Berchtesgaden, where the Nazi elite congregated around Hitler's Berghof. The children grew up in extraordinary comfort and extraordinary proximity to power. They attended dinners at the Berghof. They knew Hitler personally. They were, by the peculiar standards of the era, extraordinarily privileged children of extraordinarily powerful man. Albert Speer and Margaret had 6 children in total. There was Albert III, born in 1934, who would become an architect like his father. Then came Hilda, born in 1936, who would become the most significant of the Speer children in terms of her public engagement with her father's legacy. Friedrich, known as Fritz, was born in 1937. Margaret was born in 1938. Arnold was born in 1940. And Ernst was the youngest, born in 1943. 6 children born across the years of the Nazi regime's rise, its consolidation of power, its plunge into World War, and its ultimately catastrophic defeat. Each of these children would have to reckon, in their own way, with what their father had done and what he had failed to prevent. Hilda Speer was born on May 18, 1936, in Berlin, the second child and first daughter of Albert and Margarete Speer. Her earliest years coincided precisely with the period of her father's greatest creative influence. When she was 2 years old, Albert Speer was redesigning the Reich Chancellery. When she was 3, he was overseeing the massive renovation of the Berghof and planning the first grand boulevards of Germania. When she was 5, Germany invaded the Soviet Union. By the time she was 7, the tide of the war had turned at Stalingrad, and the dream of the 1,000-year Reich had begun its long, bloody, irreversible collapse. Hilda Speer grew up, in other words, in the eye of one of history's greatest catastrophes, insulated by her family's wealth and status from its worst immediate effects but utterly shaped by its long shadow. Her childhood memories, as she would later describe them, were in many respects ordinary ones. There was a large house, a devoted mother, siblings to play with, summers in the countryside, the rhythms of school and meals and family life. Her father was often absent, consumed by the demands of his architectural work and later by his role as Reich Minister of Armaments and War Production, the position he assumed in February 1942, following the sudden death of Fritz Tüt in a plane crash. But when he was present, Hilda would later recall, he was attentive and warm, a man who loved his children and showed it. He read to them, he took an interest in their education, he brought them gifts. He was, by the domestic measure of the era, a good father. But there was another dimension to her childhood that was anything but ordinary. The family's social world was the world of the Nazi elite. The dinner guests were Reich ministers and SS generals and Luftwaffe commanders. The holiday house on the Obersalzberg was within walking distance of the Berghof, and visits to Hitler's home were a regular feature of life. Hilda remembered Hitler as a gentle, avuncular presence from her childhood perspective, a man who was kind to the Speer children and who spoke to them with what seemed like genuine warmth. He gave them sweets. He patted them on the head. He was, from the vantage point of a small girl in the mid-1940s, simply Uncle Wolf, the friendly neighbour who happened to run Germany. That cognitive dissonance between the intimate, domestic Hitler of her childhood memories and the historical Hitler who ordered the murder of 6 million Jews and launched a war that killed tens of millions more is something that Hilda would spend the rest of her life trying to process. It is one of the most revealing and disturbing aspects of her testimony. The perpetrators of mass murder did not present themselves as monsters in their private lives. They were fathers and husbands and neighbours and dinner guests. They were ordinary in their domestic arrangements, even as they were catastrophically extraordinary in their political actions. The children of the Nazi elite had to live with that gap between the private and the public, the familiar and the monstrous, for the rest of their lives. Albert Speer's role as Reich Minister of Armaments and War Production was, it is now clear beyond any reasonable historical doubt, deeply implicated in forced labour and the exploitation of concentration camp prisoners. Under Speer's direction, the German war economy mobilized millions of slave laborers, including Jews, Soviet prisoners of war, and civilians from occupied countries, to work in the armaments factories and construction projects that sustained the German military effort. The conditions in which these workers were held and forced to labor were, in many cases, lethal. People died in their thousands, sometimes their tens of thousands, in the projects that fell under Speer's ministerial oversight. Speer's post-war defense, elaborated first at Nuremberg and then in his best-selling memoirs Inside the Third Reich, published in 1969, was that he had been an apolitical technocrat, a manager focused on production figures and logistics, insulated from and innocent of the ideological machinery of extermination that operated alongside the industrial machinery he oversaw. He claimed he had not attended the Posen Conference of October 1943, at which Himmler had spoken explicitly to the assembled Nazi leadership about the extermination of the Jews. He claimed he had not known about the gas chambers at Auschwitz, had not understood the full implications of the forced labour system he had helped to construct, had been, in some fundamental sense, blind to the genocide happening around him. The children of Albert Speer absorbed this version of their father's past during their formative years. It was, after all, the version that had been accepted, at least partly and provisionally, by the Nuremberg judges who sentenced Speer to 20 years in prison, rather than to death. It was the version that German society, in its long post-war project of selective amnesia, was broadly willing to accept. It was, in a profound and terrible sense, a comfortable version. And for the Speer children, growing up in post-war Germany and visiting their father in Spandau prison on weekends and holidays, it was the version their father told them directly, in person, across the table of the prison visiting room. Hilda Speer would later say that her childhood and adolescence was shaped by an absolute faith in her father's account of himself. She believed, as children believe the things their parents tell them, that he had been a man of culture and skill who had been drawn into a terrible system without fully understanding its nature, that he had tried to resist where he could, that he had been punished far more harshly than his actual culpability warranted, and that the 20 years in Spandau represented not just legal punishment, but a kind of purgatory, an expiation for sins that were real but limited, errors of judgment rather than crimes of the will. She visited him regularly throughout his imprisonment. She maintained a close relationship with him. She was, like all of his children, affected by his absence in ways that she would only fully begin to understand much later. Albert Speer was released from Spandau prison on September 30th, 1966, having served his full 20-year sentence. He emerged into a West Germany that had changed almost beyond recognition from the Reich he had served. The economic miracle had transformed a devastated, divided country into one of the most prosperous nations in Europe. The generation that had built the Third Reich was growing old, and a new generation of Germans was beginning to ask uncomfortable questions about what their parents and grandparents had actually done between 1933 and 1945. Speer, with his carefully curated image as the reflective, remorseful Nazi, was perfectly positioned to become, for many in this new Germany and in the English-speaking world, the acceptable face of the regime's technocratic elite. His memoirs Inside the Third Reich were a sensation. Published in 1969, they sold hundreds of thousands of copies and were translated into dozens of languages. Speer was hailed as a reliable witness to Hitler's inner circle, a man who could provide intimate portraits of the Führer that no one else could supply. The book was riveting, beautifully written, and deeply, fundamentally dishonest in ways that were not fully apparent at the time. Speer had used his 20 years in Spandau to construct an elaborate self-exculpation, and he deployed it with the skill of a man who had spent a lifetime managing impressions and navigating power. He was charming, articulate, and plausible. He gave interviews. He appeared on television. He was, for a time, something close to a celebrity. The Speer children, now young adults, watched their father's rehabilitation with a mixture of pride and, in at least some cases, a gathering unease. They had grown up with the private man, the father who read to them and brought them gifts and served his time in Spandau with stoic dignity. Now they were encountering, in an increasingly public way, the historical man, the minister of armaments who had run slave labor programs, the architect who had displaced Jewish families to make way for his grand building projects, the intimate of Hitler who had been present at the highest levels of decision-making throughout the Reich's worst years. The gap between these two figures, the private father and the historical criminal, would preoccupy the Speer children for the rest of their lives. It was Hilda who would ultimately do the most sustained and honest work of confronting that gap. She was not the only Speer child to grapple with the legacy. Her brother Albert III, who became an architect and was thus in some unavoidable professional sense living in his father's shadow, also spoke publicly about the difficulty of bearing the Speer name. But it was Hilda, perhaps because she was a woman of unusual intellectual and moral courage, perhaps because she was closest to her father in terms of temperament, perhaps simply because circumstances drew her into public life in ways that demanded accountability, who would become the most important witness to the reality of growing up in the Speer household. What did Hilda Speer actually reveal about her father, and how did those revelations evolve over the decades of her adult life? The answer to that question is complicated, and it is complicated in ways that illuminate not just the Speer family, but the broader question of how families of perpetrators come to terms, or fail to come to terms, with what their forebears did. Hilda married Reinhard Flaxman, a physician, and lived a relatively private life for many years after her father's release from Spandau. She was not, initially, a public figure. She was a daughter who loved her father, who was glad to have him back, and who was navigating, as were all the Speer children, the complicated business of rebuilding a normal family life after 2 decades of prison visits and absence. When her father was alive and active in the public sphere, from his release in 1966 until his sudden death in London on September 1st, 1981, Hilda largely stayed out of the controversy that swirled around him. There were questions raised even in the early 1970s about the honesty of his Nuremberg testimony and his memoirs. The historian Matthias Schmidt, in a devastating 1982 study titled Albert Speer, The End of a Myth, produced documentary. Evidence that Speer had indeed been informed about the extermination of the Jews and had lied systematically about it at Nuremberg and in his memoirs. But that reckoning came after Speer's death. While he was alive, the myth largely held. After her father died, Hilda began a longer, slower, and ultimately more honest process of coming to terms with what he had actually been. This was not a swift or dramatic conversion experience. It was a gradual, painful, and intellectually serious engagement with the historical record, with the testimonies of survivors, with the archival evidence that researchers like Schmidt and later Gitta Sereni, whose 1995 biography, Albert Speer, His Battle with Truth, remains the most comprehensive account of his life, brought to light. Hilda read these books. She engaged with the evidence, and she arrived, over time, at a position that was very different from the uncritical loyalty she had felt during her childhood. What Hilda came to understand, and what she eventually said publicly, was that her father had not been the unknowing innocent he had claimed. The evidence assembled by historians in the decades after his death made clear that Speer had possessed far more knowledge of the Holocaust than he had acknowledged. He had been present at key moments when the genocide was discussed at the highest levels. He had benefited materially from the forced displacement of Jewish populations. He had directed a slave labor system that operated in conditions of extreme brutality. And he had, with considerable skill and considerable calculation, constructed a false narrative about himself that had allowed him to escape the death penalty at Nuremberg, to serve a finite prison sentence, and to emerge as a public intellectual rather than as a war criminal. For Hilda, the recognition of this was profoundly destabilizing. It meant that the father she had loved and trusted had lied to her, systematically and over many decades, about the most important facts of his life and his guilt. It meant that the visits to Spandau, the conversations across the prison table, the letters he wrote, the memoirs he published, all of these had been, at least in part, performances of a carefully constructed false self. It meant that her childhood faith in him had been, without her knowledge or consent, an instrument of his self-exculpation. The family's loyalty, their continued public presentation of him as a remorseful but essentially honest man, had served his purposes in ways she could not have understood at the time. This is the deepest and most devastating thing that Heydrich Speer revealed about family life with Albert Speer, that it had been, in some fundamental sense, a life lived in proximity to a sustained and deliberate deception. The warmth, she remembered, was real. The love was real. The attentiveness and the gifts and the reading aloud and the prison visits, all of that was real. But it coexisted with a lie so large and so carefully tended that it had shaped not just his public reputation, but the entire emotional landscape of his family's life. The children of Albert Speer had been, without knowing it, participants in the maintenance of a fiction. How did Hilda speak about this publicly? She gave interviews to journalists and historians. She cooperated with researchers studying her father's legacy. She participated in documentary films about the Nazi elite and its aftermath. She did not, it should be said, become a crusader or a public activist in the manner of Nicholas Frank, the son of Hans Frank, the Governor-General of occupied Poland, who made a career of public denunciation of his father's crimes. Hilda's approach was quieter, more measured, and perhaps more psychologically honest about the complexity of loving a parent whose crimes you have come to acknowledge. She did not pretend that the love had been erased by the knowledge of the guilt. She did not perform a repudiation that she did not entirely feel. She tried instead to hold both things at once, the father she had loved and the criminal he had been. One of the most striking things Hilda revealed was the atmosphere of the Speer household during her father's lifetime, and particularly during the years of his post-Spandau celebrity. She described a home in which the subject of his wartime role was handled with enormous care, in which certain questions were not asked, certain topics were not pursued, in which the family collectively maintained a kind of protective silence around the areas where honest inquiry might threaten the carefully constructed narrative. This was not, she came to understand, because her father had explicitly forbidden discussion of certain topics, though there may have been moments of that as well. It was something more subtle and more insidious. The family had internalized the need to protect the version of events that kept their father out of the category of conscious perpetrator, and they did so without explicit instruction, as families do, through the accumulated weight of habits and silences and unspoken agreements about what was safe to say and what was not. She also spoke, in later years, about the question of what her mother Margaret had known. Margaret Speer was a woman of considerable intelligence who had been married to one of the most powerful men in the Third Reich throughout the years of its worst crimes. What had she known? What had she understood? What had she chosen not to know? These are questions that apply to many women who were married to senior Nazi officials, and the answers are rarely simple or satisfying. Margaret Speer outlived her husband by many years, dying in 1987. She had maintained, throughout her long life, a posture of loyal support for her husband's self-presentation. She had not, as far as the historical record shows, broken ranks or offered any independent account of events that contradicted his version. For Hilda, her mother's silence was itself a kind of testimony, though a testimony whose precise meaning was difficult to interpret with certainty. The question of what the children of Nazi perpetrators owe to history, to the victims of their parents' crimes, and to themselves, is one that the Speer children, like the children of many other Nazi officials, have had to confront in ways that have no easy answers. There is no template for this kind of reckoning. There is no precedent in ordinary human experience for the situation of a child who grows up loving a parent who, it gradually becomes clear, was responsible, directly or indirectly, for crimes against humanity on a massive scale. The Speer children had to navigate this without guides, in public, in a Germany that was itself slowly and painfully working through its own collective reckoning with the Nazi past. Hilda's engagement with that reckoning was, by most accounts, serious and sustained. She read the historical literature, she talked to researchers. She did not claim a certainty she did not have, and she did not perform a repudiation that felt false. She tried as honestly as she could to tell the truth about what she knew and what she did not know, about what her childhood had been and how that childhood looked different in the light of what she had since learned. That is, in the circumstances, a considerable achievement. It is not everything that a more unsparing accounting might demand, but it is something real, and it is something that stands in marked contrast to the behaviour of other children of Nazi perpetrators who chose the path of denial and defiance. Albert Speer's eldest son, Albert III, had perhaps the most publicly complicated relationship with his father's legacy of all the children, because he too became an architect, and because his work inevitably invited comparisons with and reflections on his father's career. Albert III was born on April 21, 1934, making him the eldest of the 6 children and the one who had the most memories of his father before the war and in its early years, when Albert Speer Sr. was at the height of his creative and political power. Albert III grew up knowing that his father had been one of Hitler's closest collaborators, had designed the stages on which the Nazi pageant was performed, and had run the industrial engine that kept the Wehrmacht in the field through the catastrophic later years of the conflict. Albert III carved out a successful career as an architect, working primarily in Africa and on urban planning projects in developing countries. His work had, he was at pains to emphasize, nothing in common with his father's monumental power-serving architecture. He worked on hospitals, schools, housing projects, infrastructure for communities rather than stages for totalitarian spectacle. He was, in his own way, attempting a kind of architectural redemption, a career defined in opposition to what his father's career had represented. He gave interviews in which he was frank about the burden of the name he carried and the history it carried with it. He did not pretend that his father's legacy was anything other than what it was, but neither did he make his father's crimes the organizing principle of his own public life. The youngest Speer child, Ernst, was born in 1943 when the war had already turned decisively against Germany and when his father had assumed total control of the Reich's armaments production. Ernst was too young to have any memories of his father from the Nazi years, and his experience of Speer Sr. was entirely that of the post-war father, the prisoner in Spandau, the man who emerged in 1966 and became a celebrity memoirist. In some ways, Ernst had the most uncomplicated relationship with the historical question, because his personal memories of his father contain no overlap with the period of his crimes. But in other ways, the absence of any personal memory of that period made the historical accounting harder, not easier, because there were no personal memories to set against the documentary record, no intimate knowledge of the man in the years when the worst things happened. Heydrich, known as Fritz, born in 1937, fell between these two extremes. He had childhood memories of his father that spanned the late Nazi period, including the increasingly desperate years of 1943 and 1944, when Speer was simultaneously running the armaments ministry, deploying slave labourers on a vast scale, and, according to the historical evidence, becoming aware that the war was lost even as he worked to prolong it. Fritz Speer's public engagement with his father's legacy was less extensive than Hilda's, but he too participated in the broader family process of coming to terms with what the historical record revealed. Margaret, born in 1938, and Arnold, born in 1940, were similarly positioned, children old enough to have some memories of the Nazi years and of their father's prominence within the regime, young enough that those memories were fragmentary and filtered through the distorting lens of childhood. All of the Speer children had to carry a name that, by the time they were adults, carried an enormous historical weight, a weight that had been partially redeemed by their father's carefully managed public image, but that the slow advance of historical scholarship was progressively restoring to its full and terrible dimensions. The process of historical revision regarding Albert Speer gathered pace significantly in the 1990s and 2000s. Gitta Sereni's 1995 biography, the product of years of interviews with Speer in his final years and exhaustive archival research conducted after his death, was the most comprehensive demolition of the Speer myth published to that point. Sereni, who had also written a devastating study of Franz Stangl, the commandant of Treblinka, brought the same relentless forensic intelligence to Speer that she had brought to that even more obvious monster. Her conclusion, reached after evidence that filled nearly 800 pages, was that Speer had known about the Holocaust, had been present at key moments when it was discussed, and had made a deliberate and successful choice to lie about this knowledge at Nuremberg and throughout his subsequent public life. The title of her book, His Battle with Truth, was characteristically precise. The battle was real. The truth mostly lost. For Hilde Speer and her siblings, Sereni's book was a landmark in their own evolving understanding. Hilde had cooperated with Sereni to a degree, contributing her own memories and reflections to the research process. She engaged with the book's findings with a seriousness that reflected the intellectual and moral honesty she had developed over years of private reckoning. She did not dismiss the findings. She did not retreat into the defensive posture of loyal child. She acknowledged that the evidence pointed clearly to conclusions about her father's knowledge and guilt that were far more damning than anything he had acknowledged in his public self-presentation. What did family life with Albert Speer actually look like beyond the grand historical questions of guilt and knowledge and deception? This is something Hilde and others in the family also addressed, and the picture that emerges is both illuminating and in some ways heartbreaking in its ordinariness. The Speer household was, by all accounts, a functioning family with the normal textures of domestic life. Meals and schoolwork and sibling rivalries and holidays and the ordinary passage of time. The children remember a house full of books, a mother who managed the household with competence and care, a father who was engaged with them when he was present, despite the extraordinary demands on his time. There were excursions into the countryside, visits to the theatre and to concerts, the cultivated middle-class life of a family that prided itself on its distance from the more vulgar manifestations of the Nazi culture that surrounded them. This distance from vulgarity was itself ideologically significant, though the Speer children may not have recognized it as such at the time. Albert Speer Sr. had always cultivated an image of himself as a different kind of Nazi, a man of culture and taste who was above the crude anti-Semitism and the thuggish street violence that characterized so much of the movement's character. He did not collect art looted from Jewish families, or at least not overtly. He did not make anti-Semitic speeches. He presented himself and was perceived by many as a technocrat rather than an ideologue, a man whose commitment was to Germany's architectural and industrial greatness rather than to the racial theories that underpinned the regime. The household atmosphere reflected this self-presentation. The Speer home was not a shrine to Nazi ideology in the way that, say, Himmler's household or Göring's grotesquely looted estate at Carinhall might have been. But this very cultivated normalcy was, of course, itself a deception. The beautiful home on the Schlachtensee and the comfortable estate near Berchtesgaden were made possible by the same system of racial persecution and forced labour that Speer claimed to have been ignorant of. The architectural commissions that provided the Speer family's extraordinary wealth were tainted from the beginning by the displacement of Jewish families from their homes. The children grew up in comfort that was purchased at a price they were not told about, living in a kind of aesthetic and moral bubble that their father had constructed around them with the same skill and calculation that he brought to his architectural and managerial work. One of the most significant specific memories that Hilde Speer spoke about in later years was the family's visits to the Berghof and their interactions with Hitler. These visits were, from the perspective of the Speer children, simply part of the fabric of their lives, as unremarkable in their own way as visits to any family friend might be. Hitler was attentive to children, or at least performed attentiveness convincingly, and the Speer children remembered him as a gentle, soft-spoken presence in a domestic setting that was nothing like the raving demagogue of the newsreel footage they would encounter later. He liked to show them his collection of architectural models. He spoke to them about his plans for Germany's future, translated into terms a child could understand. He was, Hilde recalled, a presence that felt safe and familiar rather than frightening. The horror of this recollection lies precisely in its ordinariness. The man who ordered the construction of the death camps, who had set in motion the systematic murder of millions of human beings, was, in the domestic setting of the Berghof, Uncle Wolf, who liked to talk about buildings and was kind to children. This is not a paradox unique to Hitler. History is full of examples of men who committed terrible acts in their public or political capacity while maintaining entirely conventional, even warm, personal relationships in their private lives. The children of Nazi officials across the board tend to describe a domestic reality that bears almost no resemblance to the historical reality of what their parents were doing. The scale of the disjunction is almost impossible to comprehend, but for Hilde Speer, comprehending it became a moral imperative. She has said that one of the things she found most difficult to reconcile as she grew older and the historical record became clearer to her was the memory of her father's obvious intelligence and moral sensitivity in other domains. Albert Speer was not a man who lacked the capacity for ethical reflection. His memoirs, dishonest as they were in their central claims, demonstrated a man capable of sophisticated moral reasoning, of understanding the weight of historical responsibility, of thinking carefully about the relationship between individual choice and systemic evil. The very fact that his self-exculpation was so skillfully constructed proved that he possessed the intellectual equipment to understand what he had actually been doing. The lie was not a product of genuine incomprehension. It was a product of deliberate and calculated choice. For Hilda, this understanding was perhaps the hardest thing of all to live with. It would have been, in some sense, easier to accept that her father had been genuinely obtuse, genuinely incapable of understanding the implications of his actions, genuinely swept along by a system too large and too powerful for any individual to resist. That version would have allowed her to preserve some element of her childhood image of him, the good and loving father who had been caught in terrible circumstances. But the evidence did not support that version. The evidence pointed to a man who had understood, had chosen, and had then chosen again to lie about his choices. That is a different kind of failure and a much more difficult one to bear. The Speer children's situation was, of course, not unique. Across the landscape of post-war Germany and Austria, tens of thousands of families were grappling with similar questions on a smaller and less publicly visible scale. The children of SS officers, of concentration camp guards, of regional Nazi administrators, and Wehrmacht generals who had issued criminal orders in the East, all of these children faced versions of the same question that confronted Hilda Speer. What do you do with the knowledge of what your parent did? How do you hold love and condemnation simultaneously? How do you build a life in the shadow of a crime you did not commit, but that was committed on your behalf and in the name of your country and your family? The German writer and psychologist Dan Bar-On conducted extensive interviews with children of Nazi perpetrators in the 1980s and published his findings in a 1989 study titled Legacy of Silence: Encounters with Children of the Third Reich. His research revealed patterns that illuminate the Speer children's experience directly. He found that families of perpetrators typically maintained strict silences around the most incriminating facts of the parents' wartime service, that children had often sensed that something was being withheld without knowing what it was, and that the confrontation with the historical record, when it came, was typically experienced as a kind of double trauma. First, the horror of the facts themselves, and then the horror of recognizing that the parent had known and had actively concealed that knowledge. This double trauma precisely describes what Hilda Speer and her siblings went through. The question of whether Albert Speer was ever honest with any of his children, in private, about what he had actually known and done, is one that cannot be definitively answered on the basis of the available evidence. Gitta Sereni, in her conversations with him in the final years of his life, came to believe that he was genuinely engaged in what she called his battle with truth, that he was wrestling with the question of his own guilt and knowledge in ways that were real even if they did not ultimately produce a full and honest public accounting. He seemed in those late conversations to be moving towards something, some acknowledgement that the carefully maintained position of the memoirs was not the whole truth. But he died before arriving anywhere definitive. Whether he said anything to his children in those final years that went beyond the official version is something only the children know. Hilda's public statements suggest that her reckoning was driven primarily by the historical evidence, rather than by anything her father told her directly. There is no record of a deathbed confession, no private letter that has come to light revealing a more honest self-assessment. If such communications existed, the family has not made them public. The absence is itself significant, and in its own way, devastating. Albert Speer died on September 1st, 1981, in London, of a stroke suffered in his hotel room. He was 76 years old. He had gone to London to give a television interview, one of many such engagements he had maintained throughout his post-Spandau career as a public intellectual and memoirist. He had been well in the days before his death, apparently in good health and good spirits. The stroke was sudden and without warning. He was found unconscious in his room and died in hospital a few hours later. The manner of his death, sudden and in a foreign city away from his family, has been noted by various commentators as somehow appropriate to the life he had led. A man who had spent his public career at one remove from authentic connection, performing a version of himself that was not entirely true, dying alone in a hotel room in a city where he had gone to perform that self one more time. Whether such observations are fair or merely melodramatic is a matter of judgment. What is clear is that his death came before the most damaging historical revelations about him had been fully assembled and publicized, and that he was therefore spared the full public reckoning that later scholarship would have forced upon him. For his children, his death marked the beginning of a new phase in their relationship with his legacy. While he was alive, there was a person at the center of the story, a father to visit and to love, a living presence whose feelings and well-being had to be taken into account. After his death, the historical Albert Speer became increasingly the only Speer. The archival figure, the subject of books and documentaries and scholarly articles, the name attached to a set of historical facts that were becoming progressively less comfortable and progressively more damning. The children had to relate to that figure without the mediating presence of the actual man they had known. Hilde Speer has spoken about this transition with considerable insight. She has described the process of reading the post-death scholarship, beginning with Matthias Schmidt's 1982 book and continuing through the vast literature that accumulated over the following decades, as a gradual and painful stripping away of the image she had carried of her father. Each new piece of evidence, each new archival discovery, each new analysis that demonstrated the gap between what he had claimed and what he had actually known and done was a further diminishment of the version of him she had loved. She did not pretend that this process was easy. She did not pretend that the love disappeared as the knowledge accumulated. She described instead a condition of sustained and irresolvable complexity, loving a man whose crimes she had come to understand and acknowledging both the love and the crimes without allowing either to cancel the other. This is, it should be said, a more psychologically sophisticated and morally honest position than many children of perpetrators have managed. Some have gone the route of total denial, insisting on their parents' innocence in the face of overwhelming evidence, becoming, like Gudrun Himmler, active apologists for the regime and its crimes. Others have gone the route of total repudiation, performing a public denunciation of their parents that sometimes seems more theatrical than genuinely felt. Hilde Speer navigated between these extremes with what appears, from the available evidence, to have been genuine intellectual honesty and moral courage. The architectural legacy of Albert Speer also formed an important part of the context within which his children, and particularly his architect's son, Albert III, had to operate. The buildings and plans that Speer had created for the Nazi regime were not simply historical artifacts. Many of them still existed, at least partially, in the post-war landscape. The Zeppelin field at Nuremberg, though partially demolished, still stood. The ruins of the Congress Hall, never completed, remained a massive and inescapable presence in the city. The Reich Chancellery had been demolished by the Soviets after the war, but photographs, models and plans remained abundantly documented in archives. And the Germania plans, Hitler and Speer's grand vision for the rebuilt Berlin, had been extensively documented and were the subject of scholarly and popular fascination. What did it mean to be an architect named Speer in post-war Germany, carrying the knowledge that your father had been the architect of Hitler's aesthetic empire? Albert III has spoken about this with considerable candour. He described a professional environment in which his name was both an asset and a burden, a calling card that opened some doors and closed others, a historical reference that followed him into every professional conversation whether he wanted it to or not. He chose to work far from Germany when possible, in contexts where the name carried less immediate historical freight, and to define his work in explicit opposition to his father's monumental power-serving aesthetic. His commitment to socially useful architecture, to buildings that served communities rather than celebrated power, was in part a deliberate professional response to his father's legacy. The Speer children also had to navigate the peculiar social geography of post-war Germany, in which many people either actively or passively maintained the kind of protective silence about the Nazi period that characterized their own family's handling of their father's past. For much of their adult lives, they were not dramatically unusual in their situation. The parents and grandparents of many of their contemporaries had served the Nazi regime in various capacities, and many families maintained similar silences and similar carefully edited versions of the past. The specific scale of Albert Speer's culpability and the specific prominence of his post-war celebrity made their situation more public and more scrutinized than most. But the underlying pattern of a family grappling with a guilty parent in a society that had not yet fully reckoned with collective guilt was widely shared. The gradual breakdown of those wider silences as German society moved through successive waves of historical reckoning in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, and beyond created the cultural and psychological conditions in which Hilde Speer's own more honest engagement with her father's legacy became possible. She was not operating in a vacuum. She was part of a broader generational movement in which the children and grandchildren of perpetrators began to ask harder questions, to demand more honest answers, and to refuse the comfortable evasions that the first post-war generation had relied on. In this sense, her personal reckoning was inseparable from a larger historical process. One of the most revealing aspects of the testimony that Hilde and other family members provided over the years concerns the question of what was discussed in the Speer household during the Nazi period itself. The children who were old enough to have any memories of those years, primarily Albert III, Hilde and Fritz, have all indicated that the domestic world of the Speer household was effectively sealed off from the ugliest realities of the regime. The war, when it was discussed at all with the children, was discussed in terms of military strategy and patriotic duty. The forced labourers who worked on Speer's construction projects were not mentioned. The Jewish families displaced from their Berlin apartments to make way for the Germania project were invisible in the family's domestic consciousness. The death camps were so thoroughly excluded from the family's conversational world that the children had no sense of them during the war years. How much of this was deliberate parental management of information, and how much was the natural insulation of children from the most brutal facts of the world around them is difficult to determine. Both factors were undoubtedly at work. Parents typically shield young children from the worst facts of life, even under normal circumstances. But the specific pattern of exclusion in the Speer household was not random or organic. It reflected, at least in retrospect, a systematic management of the information landscape in ways that served the father's long-term interest in presenting himself as someone who had not fully understood what was happening around him. Hilde has been direct about this in her later reflections. She has said that the silences in the family were not the silences of ignorance. They were the silences of selective memory, of topics that were tacitly understood to be off-limits, of questions that could be asked and questions that could not. A child absorbs these boundaries without necessarily understanding them explicitly. The prohibition is communicated not through direct instruction, but through tone, through the barely perceptible shift in atmosphere that tells a child that a particular subject is dangerous ground. By the time the children were old enough to understand why these silences existed, the pattern was too deeply ingrained to be easily challenged. The Spandau years, the 2 decades between 1946 and 1966, during which Albert Speer served his sentence, were in many ways the crucible in which the family's relationship to the past was formed. The children grew up visiting their father in prison, travelling to West Berlin on weekends and school holidays to sit across the table from him in the prison visiting room. Spandau Prison was a grim, fortress-like building in the British sector of West Berlin, built in the 19th century and designed for industrial-era incarceration. By the time Speer arrived there, it was grotesquely oversized for its actual prisoner population. At various times, Spandau held Speer, Rudolf Hess, Baldur von Schirach, Erich Raeder, Walter Funk, Konstantin von Neurath, and Karl Dönitz. As the years passed and other prisoners were released, the number dwindled. By the early 1960s, Speer and Hess were virtually alone in a building designed to hold 600 prisoners. For the Speer children, the visits to Spandau were simultaneously a source of connection with their father and a strange, institutionalized abnormality at the heart of their childhood. The prison visit was a regular feature of life, built into the calendar with the matter-of-fact inevitability of a school term. They sat in a supervised visiting room. They could not embrace their father or be embraced by him. They spoke across a table with a guard present. For young children, this was simply the way things were, the normal condition of a father who lived somewhere unusual because of something that had happened before they could remember. For older children and teenagers, it was increasingly comprehensible as something more than that, as the consequence of a specific historical guilt, even if the precise nature of that guilt remained managed and partial in the family's understanding of it. Hilda was about 10 years old when the visits to Spandau began after the Nuremberg verdict, and she continued to visit throughout her adolescence and young adult life. She has described those visits with a mix of tenderness and, in retrospect, a kind of grief for the version of her father she was being given in that setting. He was attentive, thoughtful, eager to maintain connection with his children across the impossible barrier of the prison environment. He was also, she came to understand, using those visits and the letters he wrote from Spandau as part of the sustained process of self-construction that would eventually produce the memoirs. He was working on his narrative throughout those years, shaping and polishing the story he would tell the world when he emerged. The children were, without knowing it, part of his audience. The letters that Speer wrote from Spandau are a remarkable document of this process. He was not permitted to keep a journal initially, but he developed an extraordinary system by which he passed written notes out of the prison through a sympathetic Dutch guard named Tony Proust. These notes eventually formed the basis of the Spandau Diaries, published in 1975, a companion volume to the memoirs. The letters he wrote to his family were the acceptable, official record of his prison years. They were thoughtful, sometimes moving, carefully composed communications from a man who was acutely aware of how they would be read and what impression they would create. Hilda received many letters from her father during the Spandau years. She treasured them as a child and young adult. She read them differently once she understood the context in which they had been written. Albert Speer had, it is worth remembering, very considerable time to think during those 20 years in Spandau. He also had access to books and could receive and send correspondence within limits. He used that time with remarkable productivity and deliberateness. He planned his memoirs. He cultivated relationships with journalists and former colleagues. He maintained his connection with his family in ways that sustained their loyalty and their willingness to support his public narrative. He was, throughout the Spandau years, already managing his post-prison reputation with the same skill and calculation that had characterized his managerial career in the Reich. The prison was, from one angle, simply the next phase of a career defined by the management of impressions and the projection of a carefully constructed public image. This is not to say that the suffering was not real. 20 years in prison is 20 years in prison, regardless of the privileges and the intellectual resources available to the prisoner. Speer aged visibly during those years. He missed his children's childhoods, their adolescence, their early adult lives. He was absent for the milestones that fathers are supposed to be present for. He knew, with absolute certainty, that the colleagues who had been sentenced to death at Nuremberg had been hanged within months of the verdict, while he was still alive and would remain so. He knew that he had survived by the margin of a few judges' votes in a trial that could easily have gone differently. He lived with the knowledge of that near miss for 2 decades, and whatever psychological effects that produced were real. For the family, the Spandau years imposed a distinctive shape on normal family life. Margret Speer raised 6 children largely alone, managing the household on a pension supplemented by royalties from the architectural drawings and other intellectual property that Speer had left in her care. She was not destitute, but she was far removed from the extraordinary material comfort of the Nazi years, when her husband had been one of the most powerful men in the Reich, and the family had lived accordingly. She managed with competence and dignity by all accounts, and she maintained the family's cohesion and its loyalty to the man in Spandau with what appears to have been genuine devotion. Whether that devotion was based on genuine belief in his professed innocence or on a more pragmatic calculation about the family's interests is something that Hilda, among others, has reflected on without arriving at a definitive answer. The question of Margrethe Speer is itself a significant one in any account of family life in the Speer household. She was an educated and intelligent woman who had been at her husband's side throughout the years of his greatest power and his worst crimes. She had attended social events at which the senior Nazi leadership was present. She had lived in houses built and furnished with the resources of a regime that was simultaneously operating death camps. She'd presumably, at some level, known things about her husband's work and its human costs that she chose not to examine too closely. And yet she maintained, throughout her long life, a position of loyal and uncritical support for her husband's version of events. Hilda has been careful and somewhat protective in her public comments about her mother. She has not made Margret a focus of criticism or moral examination to the degree that she has applied to her father. This is understandable. The mother who raised her and kept the family together during the Spandau years, who managed the household and maintained the emotional infrastructure of a family under enormous pressure, is a different kind of figure from the father whose crimes and deceptions were the central subject of historical scrutiny. But the silence around Margaret is itself telling. It reflects the difficulty of applying to one's mother the same standards of historical accountability that one is prepared to apply, however reluctantly, to one's father. The relationship between Albert Speer's architectural legacy and his moral legacy is one of the most complex and unresolved aspects of his story, and it is one that his children have had to navigate in their own various ways. The architecture itself is not simple to condemn in the way that the slave labour programme or the Holocaust knowledge can be condemned. Buildings are inert. They do not murder anyone. And some of what Speer designed, evaluated purely on formal architectural terms, was accomplished work. The Nuremberg rally grounds had a dramatic power that even those who find their original purpose repugnant cannot entirely deny. The models and drawings for Germania, insane in their scale and their political purpose, represent nevertheless a kind of architectural imagination, working at the extreme limit of its ambition, but the architecture is also inseparable from its purpose and its context. The Nuremberg grounds were designed to overwhelm individual consciousness and produce mass submission to totalitarian authority. The Germania plans required the displacement of tens of thousands of people and were envisioned as the physical embodiment of a racial empire founded on murder. To evaluate the architecture as architecture in abstraction from these purposes is to make the same move that Speer himself made in his memoirs, to separate the technical achievement from the moral catastrophe in which it was embedded. His children, and particularly his architect's son, Albert III, have been acutely aware of this problem, and have, in their public statements, generally refused to make that separation. One of the more poignant aspects of the Speer family's story is the question of what Albert Speer might have been had he not encountered Hitler and the Nazi movement. He was, by all accounts, a genuinely talented architect, capable of sensitive and humane work that had nothing to do with the megalomania of Germania. His early work showed a delicacy and attention to human scale that was entirely absent from the Nuremberg projects. Had he pursued a normal architectural career in a normal political environment, he might have built a distinguished body of work that was remembered for its quality rather than its infamy. The gifts were real. The tragedy is that they were placed entirely in the service of a system that perverted them. Hilde Speer has reflected on this counterfactual with appropriate ambivalence. She does not want to be seen as excusing her father by suggesting that circumstances made him what he was. She is clear that he made choices, that those choices were his own, and that the argument from circumstance, however understandable as a psychological response, is not adequate as a moral accounting. At the same time, she is honest enough to acknowledge that the father she knew was not defined solely by those choices, that the man she loved was a real person with real gifts and real capacities for warmth and connection that coexisted with the guilt and the deception. Holding both of those truths simultaneously is what she has spent much of her adult life trying to do. The historical literature on Albert Speer has continued to grow in the years since Gitta Sereni's landmark biography. Scholars have added layers of evidence, some of it newly discovered archival material, that has steadily closed off the remaining escape routes in Speer's self-exculpation. The question of his presence at the Posen conference has been definitively settled by later research, with multiple lines of evidence indicating that he was indeed there, and that he therefore heard Himmler's explicit statement of the extermination policy. The question of his knowledge of conditions in the armaments factories has been explored in detail, with evidence making clear that he received regular reports on the state of the forced labour force that left no room for genuine ignorance of its human costs. The question of his role in the displacement of Berlin's Jewish population has been documented in painstaking detail by the historian Martin Weinmann and others. Each of these pieces of evidence has added to the weight that the Speer family has had to carry. Each has further eroded the comfortable version of the story that the children grew up believing, and each has demanded, at least from those among the children who have engaged seriously with the historical record, a further revision of the image of the father they loved. For Hilde Speer, this ongoing process of historical revelation has been a permanent feature of her adult life, a steady accumulation of knowledge that has required constant psychological and moral readjustment. What lessons, if any, does the Speer family's experience offer to the broader question of how societies deal with the children and grandchildren of perpetrators? This is not a purely historical question. The dynamics that played out in the Speer household, the management of information, the cultivation of silence, the construction of a comfortable narrative to protect both the parent and the family's self-image, are dynamics that operate in families across the world whenever a parent has done something terrible, and the family must decide how to relate to that fact. The Nazi context is extreme, but the psychological and family dynamics are universal enough to carry lessons beyond the specific historical moment. One lesson that Hilda Speer's experience seems to offer is that the truth, even when deeply uncomfortable, is ultimately less destructive than a lie sustained over decades. The version of her father that she was given as a child eventually proved unsustainable in the face of the historical record. The collapse of that version was painful and disorientating. But the alternative, the continued maintenance of a fiction that required constant vigilance and constant management, would have been corrosive in its own way. The truth, however hard, at least provides a solid ground on which to stand. The lie provides nothing but the perpetual anxiety of its own exposure. Another lesson concerns the specific psychology of the child of a perpetrator. The children of Albert Speer did not choose their father. They did not choose the name they carry or the history attached to it. They were born into a situation not of their making and have had to navigate its consequences throughout their lives, without any roadmap or guidance from people who had been through anything comparable. The degree to which they have managed to do this with integrity and honest engagement is, in the circumstances, remarkable. Not all of them have achieved this equally. But the effort, particularly in Hilda's case, has been genuine and sustained. It is also worth noting what the Speer children's experience reveals about the nature of complicity and its transmission across generations. Albert Speer was complicit in Nazi crimes. His complicity was real and documented and severe, but his children were not complicit. They were the beneficiaries, without their knowledge or consent, of a system built on crime, and they were given a false account of that system by the man who had helped to build it. They have had to work out, in their own private and sometimes public ways, what their responsibility is in relation to a history they did not make, but that bears their name. Hilda Speer's answer to that question, as far as it can be reconstructed from her public statements and interviews, is that the responsibility is one of honest acknowledgement. You do not owe it to anyone to hate your father or to perform a repudiation you do not fully feel. But you do owe it to history and to the victims of his crimes to look at the facts honestly, to refuse the comfort of evasion, and to acknowledge what the record shows regardless of what you might wish it showed. That is a demanding standard. It is also, arguably, the only standard that is adequate to the gravity of what the Nazi regime did, and what so many families, not just the Speers, have spent the subsequent decades trying not to fully confront. The broader context of how the children of various other senior Nazi officials handled their parents' legacies provides a useful frame against which to understand Hilda Speer's approach. The contrast with some of her counterparts among the children of the Nazi elite is striking, and in some cases deeply instructive about the range of possible responses to an impossible situation. Consider, for comparison, the case of Gudrun Himmler, the daughter of Heinrich Himmler, the architect of the SS and one of the primary organizers of the Holocaust. Gudrun was born in 1929 and was therefore somewhat older than the Speer children when the war ended, old enough to have more substantial memories of her father and of the regime in which he had been so central a figure. Unlike Hilda Speer, who over decades moved toward honest acknowledgement of her father's crimes, Gudrun spent her entire life in active denial, becoming not merely a defender of her father's reputation, but an active participant in the post-war network that supported former SS members and their families. She was a core member of Stille Hilfe, the organization dedicated to providing assistance to convicted and fugitive SS men, and she maintained this commitment until her death in 2018 at the age of 88. She never publicly acknowledged the crimes of the Holocaust as her father's responsibility. She contested the accepted account of his death, insisting that he had been assassinated rather than having bitten a cyanide capsule. She was, in every meaningful sense, a continuing apologist for the most murderous arm of the Nazi state. The contrast with Hilde Speer could hardly be more stark. Both were daughters of men at the heart of the Nazi apparatus. Both grew up with warm personal memories of fathers who were attentive and affectionate in their domestic roles. Both had to confront, over the course of their adult lives, a historical record that was deeply incompatible with the version of their fathers they had been given as children. But where Gudrun Himmler chose denial, active apologetics and continued complicity with the network that had supported her father's crimes, Hilde Speer chose, slowly and painfully, the harder path of honest engagement. Why the difference? There is no simple answer. Part of it may be temperamental. Hilde Speer appears, from everything that has been written about her, to be a woman of genuine intellectual curiosity and moral seriousness who was simply constitutionally incapable of maintaining a position that the evidence so clearly contradicted. Gudrun Himmler's psychological constitution seems to have worked differently. The need to protect her image of her father appears to have been so powerful that no amount of contradictory evidence could dislodge it. Part of the difference may also be a matter of the specific history involved. Albert Speer had, after all, constructed a very sophisticated and partially successful argument that he had not fully known about the genocide. An argument that made it easier, at least initially, to give him the benefit of the doubt. Heinrich Himmler had organized the SS, built the death camps, commanded the Einsatzgruppen, and stood at the very center of the machinery of extermination. The case for his daughter to claim ignorance of his crimes was even harder to make with a straight face than the case Speer's daughter had to make about hers. The case of Nicholas Frank, the son of Hans Frank, offers yet another instructive comparison. Hans Frank had been the Governor-General of occupied Poland, a position from which he had overseen the exploitation and murder of millions of Polish Jews and non-Jews. He was known as the Butcher of Poland. He was tried at Nuremberg and hanged in 1946. His son Nicholas, born in 1939, came of age in post-war Germany, carrying one of the most damning names in modern history. His response was the most radical among the children of senior Nazi officials. He became a fierce and unrelenting public denouncer of his father, writing books, giving speeches, travelling to schools and universities to talk about what his father had done, carrying a photograph of his father's corpse hanging from the gallows at Nuremberg to interviews and public appearances. He wanted, in some profound psychological sense, to kill his father again and again in public, to refuse any softening of the judgment, to offer no quarter to sentiment or familial loyalty. This approach has been controversial and has divided opinion among those who study the families of perpetrators. Some have found Nicholas Frank's public denunciations courageous and exemplary, a model of how the children of criminals should relate to their parents' crimes. Others have found them psychologically troubling, motivated less by genuine moral engagement than by a complex psychological need to expiate guilt through spectacular public punishment. The psychologist Dan Bar-On, who interviewed Frank for his research, came away with a nuanced view that acknowledged both the courage and the complexity of the psychological dynamics at work. Hilde Speer's approach is, in some ways, closer to the middle ground between Gudrun Himmler's complete denial and Nicholas Frank's spectacular denunciation. She has not pretended that her father was innocent. She has not maintained the comfortable fiction that the Nuremberg judgment was a miscarriage of justice. But she has also not made public denunciation of her father the central act of her adult identity. She has tried to engage honestly with the historical record while maintaining a private, emotional relationship to her memory of him that is more complex than simple condemnation. The children of Hermann Göring provide another set of comparative data points. Göring's only daughter was Edda, born in 1938 when her father was at the height of his power as Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe and Reich Minister for Air, the second most powerful man in Germany after Hitler himself. Edda Göring grew up surrounded by extraordinary luxury. Karinhall, the vast estate north of Berlin, that her father had named after his first wife and had decorated with art looted from across occupied Europe, was one of the most opulent private residences in Germany. She had attendants, nurses, tutors, every material comfort that her father's position could provide. She was photographed regularly as an infant and small child, used by the regime as an image of wholesome Nazi family life. Edda Göring's post-war life was characterized by a persistent loyalty to her father's memory that, while less active and politically engaged than Gudrun Himmler's, was similarly resistant to honest historical reckoning. She spent years attempting to recover art that had been confiscated from the Göring estate after the war, including works that had originally been looted from Jewish collectors across occupied Europe. She contested legal proceedings aimed at returning this art to its rightful heirs, or to the states from which it had been stolen. She maintained, in her public statements, a version of her father that emphasized his personal qualities and his military career at the expense of the war crimes and the looting for which he had been tried and sentenced to death at Nuremberg, a sentence he had avoided only by swallowing a cyanide capsule the night before he was to be hanged. The art restitution battles in which Edda Göring was involved became, in the 1990s and 2000s, a very public manifestation of the unresolved business of Nazi-era theft and its aftermath. Her insistence on the family's claim to artworks that had been stolen from Jewish families was, for many observers, a particularly egregious example of the refusal to acknowledge the criminal basis of the Nazi regime's wealth. It was precisely the kind of behaviour that made Hilde Speer's more honest engagement with her father's legacy stand out by comparison. The Bormann family's experience offered yet another variation on these themes. Martin Bormann had been one of the most powerful men in the Third Reich in the war's final years, serving as head of the party chancellery and Hitler's private secretary, a position from which he had exercised enormous influence over appointments, information flow, and the daily management of Hitler's affairs. He had disappeared in the chaos of Berlin's fall in May 1945, and his fate was a mystery for decades. Martin Bormann Jr., his son, had responded to the burden of this legacy by converting to Catholicism and undertaking missionary work in Africa, an attempt at what he himself described as expiation for his father's crimes. His path, like Hilde Speer's, was one of honest acknowledgement rather than denial, though the specific form it took, the retreat into religious service and the explicit framing of his work as penance, was different from Hilde's more secular and intellectual engagement with the past. The variety of responses among the children of senior Nazi officials reflects, among other things, the variety of the psychological situations they inhabited and the variety of the specific historical facts they had to confront. There was no single correct way to be the child of a war criminal. There was no template that could be applied across the board. What mattered from the perspective of historical accountability was not the specific form of the response, but its honesty, its willingness to look at the facts clearly and acknowledge them without evasion. By that measure, Hilde Speer's engagement stands as one of the more admirable among her generation of perpetrators' children, even if it fell short, as she herself would probably acknowledge, of everything that a fully adequate accounting might demand. The specific revelations that Hilde Speer made about family life need to be understood in the context of the broader historical debate about her father's guilt and knowledge. The most significant thing she revealed was not any specific new fact about Albert Speer's wartime activities, because she was not in a position to know facts that historians with access to the archives did not have. What she revealed was the texture of domestic life with a man who was carrying a secret, the way that secret had shaped the family's emotional environment, and the specific experience of being the child of a man who had constructed a false self so successfully that even his closest family members had, for decades, accepted it as the truth. That testimony has historical value that goes beyond its specific content. It illuminates the human cost of deception on the scale that Albert Speer practiced it, not just the historical distortion it produced, not just the way it allowed a war criminal to escape the full consequences of his crimes, but the way it contaminated the emotional lives of the people closest to him. His children grew up loving a version of their father that was not entirely real. They invested trust and loyalty in a self-presentation that was, at its core, a lie. When the lie became clear, they had to do the painful work of integrating that understanding with the genuine love they had felt, the genuine warmth they had experienced, the genuine connection they had maintained with a real human being who had also been, simultaneously, something very different from what he had claimed to be. This is, in miniature, a version of the problem that Germany as a whole has had to work through in the decades since the war. The problem of loving a country and a culture and a tradition, while acknowledging that that country and culture and tradition had produced one of the worst crimes in human history. The Speer family's private reckoning mirrors the collective reckoning that German society has had to undertake, and it mirrors it with a particular intensity because Albert Speer was, for so long, the figure through whom many Germans and many outside observers tried to make sense of the larger question of how ordinary people, intelligent and cultivated people, had become complicit in the Nazi catastrophe. The fact that Speer's claimed ordinariness and claimed cultivatedness were themselves, to a significant degree, performances rather than authentic qualities, makes the mirror more distorting, but not less revealing. The question of how a man of apparent culture and apparent refinement could have served Hitler so effectively and so willingly remains an important one. The answer that Speer's own family's testimony begins to sketch out is that the cultivation and the refinement were, in some fundamental sense, instrumentalized. They were qualities deployed in the service of ambition and power rather than qualities that expressed a genuinely held value system. A man who genuinely valued culture and refinement in the deepest sense, who genuinely held the humanist values that are supposed to accompany such qualities, would not have been capable of what Speer was capable of. The aesthetics were real. The ethics they were supposed to embody were, in the end, negotiable. For Hilde Speer, coming to this understanding about her father was the work of decades. It was not a comfortable understanding, and it has not produced a comfortable relationship to his memory. But it has produced something that is worth more than comfort. An honest reckoning with a very hard truth, conducted in public, in a way that has added something genuine to the historical record and to the ongoing human work of understanding how the Nazi catastrophe happened and what it continues to mean. Albert Speer's time in Spandau was also notable for a strange and ultimately revealing episode involving his relationships with his co-prisoners, particularly Baldur von Schirach, the former head of the Hitler Youth who had also been sentenced to 20 years. Speer and Schirach had a complicated relationship that deteriorated significantly during their shared imprisonment. Schirach, in the later years of his sentence, became increasingly willing to make explicit moral statements about the regime and its crimes that went further than Speer was prepared to go. He acknowledged publicly, in ways that embarrassed and irritated Speer, that he had participated in the deportation of Viennese Jews to the East, and that this had been a crime. Speer, whose carefully calibrated public remorse had been constructed to suggest just enough acknowledgement to seem sincere without going so far as to actually indict himself, found Schirach's more explicit confessional mode threatening to his own carefully managed position. This dynamic, in which Speer was simultaneously performing remorse and managing its limits with considerable calculation, is illuminating precisely because it was observed at close range by someone in an analogous situation. Schirach, whatever his own moral limitations and his own failures of complete honesty, was in this specific respect prepared to go further than Speer. The fact that Speer found this threatening, rather than welcoming it, as a fellow act of honest accounting, is itself revealing of the true nature of his performed remorse. The letters and manuscripts that Speer produced during his Spandau years and subsequently were extensively analysed by historians in the decades after his death. The Spandau Diaries, published in 1975, revealed a man who was capable of acute self-observation, and who clearly understood, at some level, the moral dimensions of what he had been part of. But the self-observation was always ultimately in service of the exculpatory narrative, rather than a genuine attempt to tell the whole truth. He was, as Gitta Sereni put it, a man who came very close to truth on several occasions, but who always, at the last moment, drew back from it. The battle he was engaged in was real, but it was a battle he consistently chose to win by retreat rather than surrender. For his family, this ambivalence, this nearness to honesty that always stopped short of complete honesty, was both a source of lingering hope and a source of deepening disappointment. Hilde Speer has described reading the Spandau Diaries and the memoirs as an experience of being led to the edge of a revelation that never quite arrived. There were moments in those texts where her father seemed to be on the verge of saying something true and important about his own guilt, moments where the careful management of the narrative seemed about to give way to something more authentic. But those moments always passed, and the careful management reasserted itself, and the reader was left at the edge of an acknowledgement that the author was not willing to make. The question of whether Albert Speer knew, in the full sense of that word, what was happening to the Jews has been definitively answered by later historical scholarship. He knew. The evidence is now overwhelming. But the question of whether he understood what he knew, whether he allowed himself to feel the full moral weight of his knowledge, whether he was capable of genuine remorse rather than the performance of remorse, is a different and more complex question. Albert Speer's testimony suggests that the capacity for genuine feeling was present, but that it was consistently overridden by the capacity for self-protection. He was not a man without conscience. He was a man whose conscience had been systematically trained to serve his interests rather than to challenge them. The specific details of domestic life in the Speer household that emerged from the various family members' testimonies over the years add texture and colour to the broader historical picture in ways that are both illuminating and, in some cases, deeply uncomfortable. One of the things that emerges clearly is the degree to which the material comfort of the family's life was taken entirely for granted and never examined in terms of its source or its meaning. The family home in Berlin-Schlachtensee was a substantial and comfortable property that had been made available to Speer as part of his position as Hitler's architect. The Obersalzberg property near Berchtesgaden in the Bavarian Alps provided holiday accommodation in one of the most exclusive and closely guarded enclaves in Germany, a community reserved for the Nazi elite and their families. The children had access to expensive schools, to cultural events, to all the material advantages that accrued to the family of one of the Reich's senior figures. None of this was ever framed, in the family's domestic life, in terms of its origins in a system of racial persecution and forced labour. It was simply the natural condition of the family's existence. When Hilda and her siblings visited the Burghof, they did so as guests in an environment of extraordinary luxury and extraordinary power, an environment that was sustained by the same system that was simultaneously operating death camps and working slave labourers to death in the armaments factories. The beautiful alpine setting, the well-appointed rooms, the attentive staff, the powerful and famous guests, all of this was made possible by the regime whose crimes the family would spend the rest of their lives reckoning with. The children absorbed it as normalcy, because for them it was normalcy. The context that made it monstrous was entirely invisible to them. This invisibility was not accidental. It was the product of deliberate social engineering by the Nazi regime and its senior figures, who took considerable care to maintain a sharp separation between the domestic world of the elite and the industrial machinery of death that operated elsewhere. The Burghof was not near a concentration camp. The family home in Schlachtensee was in a pleasant suburban neighbourhood, far from the armaments factories, where slave labourers worked in lethal conditions. The regime understood, instinctively, that the families of its senior figures needed to be insulated from the worst realities of what the regime was doing, both for their psychological comfort and for the maintenance of the public image of normality and prosperity that the Nazi propaganda machine was at pains to project. Albert Speer has reflected on this manufactured insulation with considerable insight. She has noted that the ease with which the comfortable domestic world was maintained, the seamlessness with which it presented itself as natural and normal, was itself a kind of achievement of the system. It required no effort on the part of the family members to maintain their ignorance of what was happening elsewhere. The ignorance was provided to them, packaged and delivered as a standard feature of their privileged position. You didn't have to work to not know. Not knowing was the default condition, and knowing would have required an active effort of inquiry that the family's circumstances made both unnecessary and implicitly discouraged. The specific question of whether Albert Speer ever discussed any aspect of the regime's crimes with his wife in terms that the children might have overheard, or that Margaret might have shared with them, is one that cannot be answered definitively on the basis of available evidence. What is clear is that if such discussions occurred, their content was never transmitted to the children in any form. The children's accounts of their domestic life contain no memory of overhearing conversations that suggested awareness of the Holocaust, no moment of accidental discovery of a compromising document, no overheard telephone call that opened a window onto what was happening beyond the comfortable bubble of the family home. If such windows existed, they were effectively shuttered. One area where the family's testimony has been particularly revealing concerns the post-war years in the immediate aftermath of Germany's defeat, before Albert Speer was transferred to Spandau. The period between Germany's surrender in May 1945 and the conclusion of the Nuremberg trials in October 1946 was an extraordinary one for the families of the Nazi elite. The world they had inhabited had ceased to exist. The material comfort and social privilege that had defined their lives had vanished overnight. The men who had commanded armies and run ministries were sitting in the dock at Nuremberg being charged with crimes against humanity. The women and children were left to manage as best they could in a Germany that was physically destroyed, economically prostrate, and in a state of collective shock about what the regime it had supported had actually done. For the Speer children, this period was experienced naturally, primarily in terms of its immediate personal impact: the loss of the comfortable home, the disruption of normal life, the absence of the father who was now a prisoner awaiting trial. Hilda was about 9 years old at Germany's surrender, too young to have a politically sophisticated understanding of what was happening, but old enough to have a visceral sense of the disruption and danger of the moment. The family moved between various temporary accommodations in the immediate post-war period, dependent on the charity of friends and acquaintances in a country where everyone was struggling. The Nuremberg trial itself was, for the family, a period of acute anxiety and, ultimately, an ambivalent relief. The death sentences handed down to Göring, Ribbentrop, Keitel, Kaltenbrunner, Rosenberg, Frank, Frick, Streicher, Seyss-Inquart, Bormann in absentia, and Jodl were a devastating demonstration of the stakes involved. Albert Speer's sentence of 20 years, when it was announced on October 1, 1946, was received by the family as something close to a reprieve. He was alive. He would serve his time and return. The relief was real and understandable. The fact that the sentence had been achieved through a systematic campaign of dishonesty about his actual knowledge and guilt was not something the family was in a position to understand at the time. The visits to Nuremberg during the trial period, in which Margaret and some of the children were permitted to see Albert Speer in the prison facility where he was held, were further formative experiences for the children who were old enough to participate in them. Hilda, at 9 or 10, was present for some of these visits. She saw her father in the unusual context of a prisoner undergoing a high-profile international trial for the worst crimes in modern history. She saw him in the controlled, supervised environment of the prison visiting room, composed, thoughtful, explaining to her mother and children in whatever terms were appropriate for their ages that everything was going to be all right, that justice would prevail, that the truth of his limited culpability would be recognized. Whether he believed this himself or whether he was performing reassurance for his family's benefit, or some complex combination of both, is impossible to determine with certainty. What is certain is that the performance, if that is what it was effective. The family maintained its faith in his basic honesty throughout the trial period and throughout the years of Spandau. The management of the family's expectations and beliefs was, from the beginning, an integral part of the larger project of managing the public narrative. It is worth pausing to consider the specific charge of using forced labour, which was one of the central counts on which Albert Speer was convicted at Nuremberg. The forced labour programme that operated under his direction as Reich Minister of Armaments and War Production was, in its scale and its brutality, one of the major crimes of the Second World War. By the war's end, approximately 12 million foreign workers and prisoners had been deployed in the German war economy, a significant proportion of them in conditions of extreme deprivation and danger. Many died. The specific programme of deploying concentration camp prisoners in the armaments industry, which operated under what was known as the Jägerstab programme and which Speer's ministry oversaw, was particularly lethal. The prisoners were worked in conditions designed to extract maximum labour in minimum time, with no regard for their survival. Speer's defence at Nuremberg was that he had not known about the conditions in which the forced labourers were held, that he had dealt with the statistical aggregate of the labour supply without knowledge of the human realities at the individual level. This defence was partially successful in the sense that it contributed to his receiving a prison sentence rather than a death sentence, but it was, as later research made clear, essentially dishonest. He had received reports on the condition of the labour force. He had visited facilities where forced labour was used. He had had relationships with managers and overseers who knew exactly what the conditions were. The claim of ignorance was the same strategic performance of limited knowledge that characterized his broader self-defense, and it was equally constructed for effect rather than rooted in genuine truth. For the Speer children growing up in the post-war decades, the forced labour question was one of the most uncomfortable aspects of the historical record to absorb, because it was one where the connection between their father's direct managerial responsibility and massive human suffering was clearest and least deniable. The Holocaust, at least as Speer had framed his own relationship to it, was something he had claimed to have been peripheral to and ignorant of. But the armaments ministry was his own creation, his own domain, the arena in which he had exercised total authority. To claim ignorance of what was happening within his own ministry in relation to a program that he himself had overseen was a claim of a different and more obviously implausible kind. Himmler Speer has not spoken at length in public about her own processing of this specific aspect of her father's legacy. But the broader pattern of her engagement with the historical record suggests that she has arrived at an honest assessment. Her father knew what the forced labour programme involved, chose to use it because it served the production targets he had committed to meeting, and then lied about his knowledge at Nuremberg and in his subsequent public life. This is, in essence, what the historical record shows. Accepting it requires accepting that the father she loved was capable of overseeing a system that killed people, and then lying about it for the rest of his life. That is not an easy thing to accept about a parent. It is also not a conclusion that honest engagement with the evidence permits one to avoid. The question of what Albert Speer's relationship with Hitler actually consisted of at its core has been extensively examined by historians and biographers, and the family's testimony provides a supplementary but important strand of evidence. Speer himself described the relationship in his memoirs in terms that were carefully calibrated to maintain his self-portrait as an apolitical aesthetic. He had been fascinated by Hitler's vision, drawn in by his charisma, seduced by the commission of a lifetime, but never a true believer in the ideological program. He had related to Hitler, he claimed, as one professional to another, as an architect to a visionary client, rather than as a devoted follower to a revered leader. Later, historians found this account deeply unconvincing. The personal warmth that Speer expressed toward Hitler in private correspondence and in the unguarded moments of his Spandau diary entries was not the warmth of a professional for a difficult client. It was something closer to the warmth of a devoted disciple for a charismatic teacher, or even, in some analysts' reading, something resembling a son's attachment to a father figure. Speer's own father had been a somewhat cold and distant figure who had not provided the warmth and approval that the young Alba craved. Hitler, who was extraordinarily skilled at identifying and exploiting the emotional needs of the people around him, had provided exactly the kind of passionate personal attention and public validation that Speer had been seeking. This psychological dynamic is relevant to the Speer children's experience because it suggests that the father they knew was himself, in some sense, still in the grip of an attachment that had never been fully resolved. The warmth and attentiveness that Hilda and her siblings remembered in their father was real, but it existed in a context where Albert Speer Sr. had devoted the most creative years of his life to the service of a man who had turned out to be the worst criminal in modern history. Processing the implications of that attachment was work that Speer himself was never quite able to complete, and its incompletion shaped everything he did and said in the post-war years, including everything he said to his family. The German-language literature on the families of Nazi perpetrators has grown substantially since the 1980s, and it has added important nuance to the picture of how these families functioned and how they transmitted their versions of the past to subsequent generations. The psychoanalyst and researcher Judith Kestenberg, who worked with both Holocaust survivors and children of perpetrators, identified a concept she called transposition, the process by which parents' unprocessed traumatic histories are transmitted to children in ways that shape the children's psychological development without the children necessarily knowing what is being transmitted or where it comes from. In the case of the Speer family, something like this transposition seems to have occurred. The children absorbed, without explicit instruction, a set of emotional orientations and psychological defenses that reflected their father's own unprocessed guilt and need for self-protection. This is not to pathologize the Speer children or to suggest that they were merely passive recipients of a transmitted psychology. They were intelligent, active agents who made their own choices about how to relate to their father's legacy, but understanding the psychological mechanisms at work helps to explain why the process of arriving at honest reckoning was so slow and so difficult, why it required decades rather than years. Why it involved not just intellectual reappraisal, but a kind of emotional archaeology, a digging down through layers of inherited affect and assumption to reach something that felt genuinely one's own, rather than transmitted from outside. Hilde Speer's public engagement with these questions has been spread across many decades and many different formats: interviews with journalists, conversations with biographers and historians, participation in documentary films, and presumably a great deal of private reflection that has never been made public. The picture that emerges from these varied engagements is of a woman who has taken the question of her father's guilt seriously, who has read the scholarship carefully, who has been willing to revise her understanding as new evidence has emerged, and who has tried to communicate her evolving understanding honestly without pretending to a certainty or a completeness of judgment that she does not have. This honesty about the limits of her own knowledge and the complexity of her own feelings is, in some ways, one of the most valuable things she has offered to the historical record. The temptation for the children of perpetrators is to claim either total exoneration, my parent was innocent or misunderstood or unjustly condemned, or total condemnation, I have completely renounced my parent and everything they did and stand. Both of these positions have the virtue of clarity and the vice of falseness to actual human experience. Actual human experience is more complicated, more ambivalent, more resistant to clean resolution. Hilde Speer's willingness to occupy that complicated middle ground, to hold love and condemnation simultaneously, to acknowledge both the genuine human being she had known and the criminal that human being had also been, is more psychologically authentic and more historically honest than either of the clean positions would have been. The documentary and film record of Albert Speer is, by the standards of senior Nazi officials, unusually rich. He was photographed extensively during his years as Hitler's architect, and the visual record of his work at Nuremberg and in Berlin is substantial. He appeared on film at the great Nazi rallies, often at Hitler's side, a tall, handsome, well-dressed figure who carried himself with the easy authority of a man entirely at home in the upper reaches of power. He gave interviews in the post-war years that were widely distributed and that contributed to the public image of the thoughtful, remorseful, culturally sophisticated Nazi that his memoirs had created. These films and photographs form part of the historical record with which his children have had to live. For Hilde Speer and her siblings, seeing their father in these historical images must have required a particular kind of psychological adjustment. The man in those images, striding across the Nuremberg grounds he had designed, sitting beside Hitler at formal dinners, presiding over the machinery of the armaments ministry, was simultaneously the father they had known and a historical figure from a catastrophic past that they had not witnessed directly. The doubling is vertiginous. The private person and the public figure, the loving father and the complicit minister, occupying the same body in the same photographs. Learning to hold both versions in view simultaneously, to see the private man in the public image and the public criminal in the private memory, is the specific psychological work that the children of Nazi perpetrators have had to do. The documentation that survived the war also included the architectural drawings and models for Germania and the other grand projects that Speer had designed for Hitler. These materials, preserved in various German and international archives, represent a record of Speer's creative imagination, working at its most ambitious and most perverse. The models for the Great Dome, the Triumphal Avenue, the vast governmental buildings show a mind capable of genuine architectural vision, deployed entirely in the service of totalitarian grandiosity. The aesthetic quality of some of this work is undeniable, which is precisely what makes it so uncomfortable. It is easier psychologically to deal with evil that is also ugly. Evil that is also beautiful forces a more complex and unsettling engagement. Albert Speer, who became an architect himself, has had to relate to this architectural legacy in the most direct possible professional terms. He has been asked throughout his career whether he sees his father's influence in his own work, whether the aesthetic sensibilities he developed were shaped by his father's example. His answers have been carefully considered and, for the most part, explicitly rejecting of any connection. He has described his own architectural philosophy as being defined in explicit opposition to his father's. Where Albert Speer Sr. designed for the glorification of power, Albert III has tried to design for the service of communities. Where his father worked in a scale designed to overwhelm, he has worked in a scale designed to serve. Whether this opposition is entirely conscious and deliberate, or whether it also reflects less acknowledged influences, is impossible to know from outside. But the explicit rejection of the paternal architectural legacy is itself a form of engagement with it. The question of Germany's ongoing relationship to the physical remnants of Albert Speer's work has been a persistent one in the post-war decades. The Nuremberg rally grounds are perhaps the most significant surviving example of his large-scale work. The Zeppelin field where the great rallies were held is still largely intact, though heavily weathered and partially deteriorated. The Congress Hall, that vast unfinished building in the style of the Roman Colosseum, sits like a monument to interrupted megalomania on the edge of a lake. Nuremberg has grappled for decades with the question of what to do with these structures. Preserve them as historical monuments, demolish them, let them decay, develop them for other uses. The debate has been heated and remains unresolved, and it is a debate that has directly or indirectly involved the Speer family's legacy in ways that the children have had to navigate. The Memorial and Documentation Centre that was eventually established at the Nuremberg rally grounds represents one approach to this impossible problem. Using the site itself as a context for education about the crimes it was associated with, making the scale and the aesthetic power of Speer's architecture serve the understanding of what that architecture was designed to celebrate and what it helped to normalise. It is an approach that the Speer family has, as far as can be determined from public statements, generally supported, or at least not opposed. The transformation of a site of Nazi pageantry into a site of historical education is, from their perspective, probably the best available outcome for the physical legacy of their father's most celebrated and most contaminated work. The specific testimony that Hilde Speer provided to the documentary film record about her father includes contributions to several films that examined his life and legacy in the post-war period. She has appeared in interviews, provided personal recollections, and engaged with historians and filmmakers in ways that have added a personal dimension to the historical record. What she has said in these contexts is, in general, consistent with the picture that emerges from her other public statements. A woman who loved her father, who has come to understand the full extent of his crimes, and who is engaged in the sustained and difficult work of holding both of those realities simultaneously, without allowing either to cancel the other. One of the most significant things Hilde has said publicly, in various formulations across various interviews, concerns the question of what her father's life means for the broader understanding of how educated, cultured people came to serve totalitarianism. She has resisted the comfortable conclusion that her father was simply a monster, a category that would place him outside the range of normal human psychology, and therefore outside any implications for how ordinary people might behave under similar circumstances. She has insisted instead on seeing him as a human being who made choices, terrible and consequential choices, but choices that were made by a specific person with specific motivations, vulnerabilities, and capacities. Understanding those choices and the mechanisms that produce them is more historically valuable than simply condemning them from a safe distance. This insistence on the humanity of the perpetrator is, of course, deeply uncomfortable for many people, and particularly for the survivors of the crimes that perpetrators like Albert Speer committed or enabled. There is an entirely understandable and legitimate feeling that to humanize the perpetrators is, in some sense, to diminish the horror of what they did and to open a door to exculpation. Hilde Speer is not unaware of this concern. She's been careful to frame her engagement with her father's humanity in ways that do not suggest exculpation, that maintain the clear moral judgment that what he did was wrong, and that his lying about it compounded the wrong. But she has maintained the position that honest understanding requires seeing the human being, not just the criminal, and that this kind of understanding, however uncomfortable, is ultimately more useful for the prevention of future atrocities than a simple condemnation that places the perpetrators beyond the range of human comprehensibility. This is a position that has been endorsed in various forms by many of the scholars and psychologists who have worked most seriously with the question of perpetrator psychology. Hannah Arendt's concept of the banality of evil, whatever its specific limitations as applied to the particular case of Adolf Eichmann, for whom she developed it, captures something important about the way that ordinary human psychological mechanisms, the desire for advancement, the capacity for compartmentalization, the ability to follow orders, can be recruited into the service of extraordinary evil. Albert Speer is, in many ways, a better example of this mechanism than Eichmann, because Speer was neither ordinary in his talents nor simple in his motivations. He was a complex, highly intelligent, artistically gifted man who chose, repeatedly and with full awareness of the general nature of the system he was serving, to continue serving it. Understanding that choice and what it says about the relationship between intelligence, culture, and moral failure is one of the important intellectual tasks that his daughter's testimony helps to illuminate. The question of whether Albert Speer was capable of genuine remorse, as distinct from the performance of remorse, is one that Gitta Sereny explored at length and that Hilda has touched on in her own public statements. Sereny came to believe, after years of conversations with him, that Speer was engaged in a genuine and painful psychological struggle with the question of his own guilt, but that this struggle was ultimately unsuccessful because it was never able to overcome his need for self-protection. He came very close, on several occasions, to an honest acknowledgement that went beyond the carefully managed public position. He pulled back each time at the last moment. Hilda Speer's perspective on this question is inevitably inflected by her personal experience of him. She knew him as a man who was, in his private emotional life, capable of genuine feeling and genuine engagement with the people he loved. She has no doubt that the love he expressed for his family was real. She has no doubt that his stated regret about the years spent in Spandau away from his children reflected a genuine sense of loss. But she has also come to understand that the performance of remorse and the actual experience of remorse are not the same thing, and that a man capable of constructing and maintaining the elaborate self-exculpation that her father constructed and maintained was a man in whom the performance had, at some deep level, displaced the authentic experience. The Speer family's story raises questions that go beyond the specific historical case and touch on universal aspects of family life, parental deception, and the transmission of guilt across generations. Every family has its secrets, its managed narratives, its areas where the full truth is not spoken, and the children are given a version of events that serves the parents' needs rather than the demands of complete honesty. The scale of the Speer family's secret and the historical enormity of the crimes it concealed are exceptional, but the psychological mechanism is universal. Children are given the version of their parents that their parents can bear to present. Growing up means, among other things, gradually discovering the fuller truth. In the Speer family's case, the process of discovering the fuller truth took the better part of 4 decades, was assisted by a substantial scholarly literature, required the overcoming of both personal loyalty and inherited psychological defences, and produced, in at least some of the children, a genuinely honest engagement with a very hard inheritance. That engagement deserves acknowledgement, not because it fully discharges any debt to the victims of Albert Speer's crimes, but because it represents a meaningful attempt to make something true and useful from a legacy that could so easily have been met with denial, evasion, and continued dishonesty. The victims of Albert Speer's crimes were not, of course, primarily the members of his family who suffered real losses from his absence and real psychological damage from his deceptions, but who were never subjected to anything remotely comparable to the forced labour, displacement, and mass murder that his policies enabled and directed. The victims were the Jewish families of Berlin, displaced from their homes to make way for Germania. They were the slave labourers in the armaments factories, worked to death in service of production targets that Speer set and managed. They were the millions of people whose lives were prolonged in their suffering by a German war economy that Speer's managerial genius kept functioning months or years longer than it might otherwise have. They are the primary moral referent in any assessment of Albert Speer and his legacy, and Hilda Speer, to her credit, has maintained an awareness of this throughout her engagement with her father's life. In the late decades of her life, Hilda Speer has been less publicly visible than she was in the period of the most active historical debate about her father. The major scholarly questions about his guilt and knowledge have been settled, at least to the satisfaction of the historical community, and the cultural moment of intense fascination with his case has passed. She has lived, for the most part, a private life, as a wife, a mother, and presumably a grandmother, carrying the inheritance of her father's name and his crimes into the generations that have followed. What she has made of that inheritance in private over the long arc of a life lived in the shadow of one of the 20th century's most complex and disturbing careers is something that only she and those closest to her fully know. What she has said publicly, however, and what it reveals about the nature of family life with Albert Speer, constitutes a genuine contribution to the historical record. It tells us that the private Albert Speer was a recognizable human being with real capacities for love and warmth and parental care. It tells us that those capacities coexisted with a sustained and calculated dishonesty about the most important facts of his life. It tells us that the domestic world he created for his family was itself a managed environment, shaped by the same skills of impression management and narrative construction that he deployed in his public career. It tells us that the cost of maintaining a lie of that magnitude is paid eventually, not just by the liar, but by the people who trusted him. The Speer family story is, in the end, a family story, with all the complexity and ambivalence and grief that family stories involving terrible secrets necessarily contain. It is also a historical story, one thread in the much larger story of how Nazi Germany happened, how it sustained itself, how it ended, and what has been left behind. Hilde Speer's willingness to engage with that story honestly, to offer her testimony about what she saw and felt and eventually came to understand, is a gift to the historical record, however uncomfortable its implications. It is the gift of someone who chose, when she could easily have chosen otherwise, to look at the truth rather than away from it. And what a truth it was. Not a simple truth, not a clean one, not a truth that resolves into comfortable moral categories or offers easy lessons. A truth about the complexity of human beings who are capable of love and capability and genuine aesthetic achievement, and also simultaneously of terrible crimes and sustained deception. A truth about the families that form around such people and the damage they absorb without knowing it. A truth about the long, slow, painful work of honest reckoning with a catastrophic past. Work that is never fully completed, but that is, in its very incompleteness and its very difficulty, testimony to the seriousness with which the people doing it take the weight of what they have inherited. Albert Speer left behind more than his crimes and his lies. He left behind 6 children who had to make their own lives and their own moral accountings in the shadow of everything he had done and failed to do. The degree to which those children, and particularly Hilde, have met that challenge with integrity and honest engagement is, in the circumstances, something worth recognizing. It does not redeem Albert Speer. Nothing could do that. But it suggests that the human capacity for honest reckoning, however long it takes, and however hard the path, is not entirely extinguished even in the most difficult of circumstances. The story of what Albert Speer's daughter revealed about family life is, ultimately, a story about the limits and the possibilities of truth-telling within families where enormous secrets are maintained. It is a story about how children absorb the emotional and psychological landscape of their parents without necessarily understanding what that landscape contains. It is a story about how the confrontation with historical reality, when it comes, produces not simple resolution, but a more complex and more honest relationship to the past. And it is a story that, for all its specific historical context, speaks to universal human experiences of love, deception, loyalty, and the slow, difficult work of seeing clearly. Well, that is it for today. Thank you for watching. We hope you found this deep dive into one of the most complex and unsettling family stories of the 20th century genuinely illuminating. If you enjoyed this video and want to explore more of the human stories behind the history of the Third Reich, make sure to check out our video on what happened to the wives of Nazi leaders after World War II. And our examination of what happened to the children of Nazi leaders after the war. Both videos go deeper into the fascinating and disturbing world of the families of the Nazi elite and what became of them once the regime collapsed. Do not forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another piece of in-depth World War II history from Next Lev. See you in the next one. There is one more dimension of Hilde Speer's testimony that deserves extended consideration before we close, and that is the question of memory itself. She has spoken in various interviews over the years about the way that her memories of her father have changed as her understanding of him has deepened. The childhood memories, she has noted, do not disappear when the historical knowledge accumulates. They do not become false or unreal, simply because the context in which they were formed turns out to have been constructed on false premises. The warmth she felt in his presence was real warmth. The love she received was real love. The attentiveness and the interest he showed in her life and her development were genuinely given and genuinely received. None of that can be simply erased by the knowledge of what he also was and what he also did. But the memories do change in their meaning. A memory that once simply recorded a pleasant experience, a dinner at the Berghof, an evening when her father read aloud to the family, a holiday in the mountains near Berchtesgaden, now carries with it the weight of everything she knows about the context in which those experiences occurred. The pleasant dinner was hosted by the man who ordered the extermination of the Jews. The evening of reading aloud was an evening in a house made possible by the displacement of Jewish families from their homes. The mountain holiday was a stay in a compound reserved for the elite of a regime that was simultaneously operating death camps a few hundred miles to the east. The memories are the same memories. Their meaning has been utterly transformed. This transformation of meaning, she has suggested, is itself a kind of historical education, a visceral demonstration of what it means to live in a context of enormous moral catastrophe without being able to see it for what it is. The people who lived ordinary lives in Nazi Germany, the millions who went to work and raised their children and maintained their relationships and pursued their pleasures in the years of the regime, were not therefore innocent of the system in which they lived. The ordinary life was itself a product of and a contribution to an extraordinary evil. Understanding this at the most personal and visceral level, through the transformation of one's own most intimate memories, is a different kind of knowing from reading about it in a history book. It is the kind of knowing that Himmler Speer has spent her life working to achieve and to communicate. The legacy of Albert Speer, then, is not only a historical legacy of architectural achievement and managerial genius deployed in the service of totalitarian evil. It is also a family legacy, transmitted through 6 children and their descendants, of the need to reckon with an ancestor whose gifts were real and whose crimes were real and whose sustained dishonesty shaped the family's emotional landscape in ways that have taken generations to fully understand. Himmler Speer's contribution to this reckoning is not complete, and it is not entirely satisfying to everyone who might demand a fuller accounting. But it is genuine, and it is honest, and in a story where dishonesty was so pervasive and so consequential, honesty is worth a very great deal.